I am Constance Cherry, and the topic that I'll be really working out sessions is called The Worship Architect, as was mentioned. And the reason for that is I've done a series of books using this metaphor. And the first book was The Worship Architect. And basically, what I came up with, I felt that to talk about worship studies, to talk about worship in the life of the church, um, this metaphor appeared to me, kind of came into my heart and mind, and I began to compare the ideas of what a worship leader does to what an architect does. And I'll explain that in a minute with a series of PowerPoints. But just want to say that I am someone who loves the church. I am a teacher, I'm a professor, but I'm also a pastor. And about half of my career, I was a minister of music and worship in local churches. So what I present to you today is not coming out of theory alone, but very much theory and practice. And so the conjoining of those two are very, very important to me. I love the church. I love the local church. I love worship. I love God. And so it's not like an academic discipline that interests me, but the theology of worship as it's applied to worship in the local church is really interesting. That's where my heart is. That's where my call is. But even though I'm a formal worship leader and I'm a leader of leaders in worship, so to speak, the work that I do and even what I present today isn't explicitly limited to music or to formal worship on Sunday morning, although much of what I'll do today is about that because that represents most of my work. But it's really applicable to people who minister in all kinds of art forms. In fact, I do work with a lot of local artists, different types of artists. And so you'll have to make an application there, but I think it's quite applicable. And not only in the church, but as I think about lay leaders who are out in business or out in the workforce, out in culture in general, and law, I think you'll be able to see as we go through how applicable some of these principles are to just everyday life of being a Christian and a disciple of Jesus. So I'm excited about where the Lord has taken me and excited to be with you today. I've decided that I'll basically roughly have three 30-minute sessions, and all of these tie into what it means to be a worship architect, which I will explain the metaphor in just a second. The first session will have to do with God-centered worship. This is a topic near and dear to my heart, and I'll unwrap that. The second topic will have to do with participatory worship. I think that's a big topic where people are really interested in what does it mean to be a fully engaged participant as a worshiper in the life of the church. And then the third topic is specifically about music, selecting songs for worship, how leaders can think theologically, biblically, culturally, musically, philosophically about the songs that we sing. So I think all three of those are super relevant, and that's why I'm excited to continue to do my work in this way. Let's talk for a minute about the metaphor of the worship architect. You know, when you think about a regular architect, a building architect, they have a series of things that they do as they come and go about their job. They do things like this. I've got some PowerPoint to go along with this. They study the landscape. They look at the purpose of the building to which they're going to be building. They have conversations with those who will use the building. That's a big deal. They create a concept or draw a picture, just an initial kind of formal image of what this could look like. They frame the building. They install load-bearing walls. They cut out doors and windows and they place the roof on. In other words, there's a series of procedures that they go about. And when I started thinking about building services of worship, I started to think about how, in a way, we also have a series of procedural steps that we take that are not unlike that of an architect. So first of all, we study the church landscape, and I call that culture. We ask questions about what's going on in our culture. We get a good look, a good read, if you will, at the landscape. Then we look at the purpose of the service, just like a regular architect would look at the purpose of the building. We have conversations with those who facilitate worship. That might be clergy, lay people, um, people who are long-term members, people who are short-term members. We create a concept or the design for a service. In other words, we kind of outline what we have in mind as a starting image. Then we lay biblical foundations, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And then we set the cornerstone, and that we call that cornerstone Jesus Christ. And we'll talk again about how that image of a cornerstone in a regular building parallels with the cornerstone of our worship, which is Jesus. Then we frame the service. We install load-bearing walls to kind of create rooms of encounter with God in a service of worship. We install doors and windows. That's what I call like the prayers, the songs, the ways that we access the light or the encounter of worship. And then we might leave the roof off. I've been learning over my lifetime that um, earthly worship joins heavenly worship. So there's always this ongoing sense of the people of God on earth participating in something that's also going on in heaven. So in this way, I kind of use the metaphor to help give shape to my thinking. And we're not going to cover all of those things in this 30-minute session, but what I'd like to do in this case is to talk about what are some of the biblical foundations of worship. If you build anything, you have to ask on what foundation is this laid. So I'm going to ask questions like what things have to be in place in order to be faithful to Scripture. I'm going to also ask a very important question that I don't think a lot of people are asking, and it's this question. What aspects of worship does God require? You know, if you start to think about, does God have an idea for worship? Does God have expectations for worship? Does God have non-negotiables for worship? If so, what are they?